In this part, I'll talk about my time in Iraq, as well as some other stories people told me about their experiences in Iraq that had an impact on me. So then came my time in Iraq, and you're probably expecting some crazy stories, but this was 2011. It's kind of anticlimactic for the most part. So we flew into Iraq, into Mosul, right into the base. So when the Americans first took Mosul back in 2003, they turned the airport into a military base, and it's called COS, or Cas Morez. And so there's a couple interesting things about the base. One was the Ugandan soldiers who were generally pulling base security. And I was like, I didn't know there were like Ugandan soldiers here, or like private contractors, really. And apparently there's a lot of Ugandans that were being recruited to go to Iraq to make some money. And the pay apparently wasn't that good compared to like what American private contractors make, but it is what it is, I guess. And for their country and the money worth it there, it's actually a considerable amount of money, but still a tiny fraction, even in comparison with what the value of money. Even when you factor that in, they still aren't making that much compared to even American soldiers, really. But they're very nice people, and they're quite chill. I had a fun time with them from time to time. Another thing too was the occasional rocket attacks. There'd be like a siren that'd go off from the base pretty regularly, especially at night. They'd try to just like wake you up with rockets, and you'd be like, okay, whatever. You hear the siren go off, and then you go into this like covering of concrete, which they call the bunker, and you hear a couple explosions like a kilometer away or something, and then you go back to bed. That was like a regular occurrence. I think they would just do it to wake you up, really. And I think apparently they were really shooting at the airport to try and hit like aircraft and stuff, but they never hit anything really. And Iraq was, in the summer, it was like pretty hot, but I was in really good shape. But I sweat more than probably any other time in my life there. And interestingly enough, when the winter came, it actually even snowed in Mosul. I didn't know that Iraq could get that cold. The winter was quite cold, actually. And I remember my first line supervisor, you could say, my NCO. So one of his jobs was to talk with the interpreters, right? And I was like, finally, I can meet some Iraqis and like learn their culture a bit, maybe learn some Arabic even. And he took me with, because he needed to take someone with him to go and talk to them, and he'd give them like a briefing on like what's coming up for them and stuff. Like he'll be going here, he'll be going there, next couple of days, next week, this is what's going on. And so he took me with him the first time, and there's these two guys living in like a little house type of thing. And they were like, hey, how's it going? They had like such good like etiquette and stuff. And they're like, hey, how's it going? If you want to come and have a seat, we'll have some tea, and we'll show you how to write your name in Arabic. And I was like, in my head, I was like, that sounds awesome. I didn't say anything. It was all up to him, and he was like, oh no, he's like, we'll have this clipboard. I have to, it's all business. He's like, maybe another time. And then he tells him what's coming up, and then we leave. And I was like, hey, like, do you want to take him up on that? And he was like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, man, I really wanted to hang out with those guys. I never had a chance, really. And then another time we went and met with a bunch of other interpreters, like 8 or 10. And this guy gave us like a fruit. I think it might be called like Ain Jebel, I think, in Arabic, as I've learned since. And and he was like, yeah, here, try this, and he showing us like Iraqi food and stuff. And I was like, I was really into like learning about food and culture and language, and the moment of an opportunity was like exciting to me. And he was like, yeah, he gives each of us this fruit, and we're eating it, and I was like, yeah, it's kind of good. And he's like, and it'll make you strong in bed with your wife. And we're like, oh yeah, we're not gonna be doing anything of that lately. It's like yeah, it's like none that's gonna go on here, but it's still a good fruit though. And I remember there was one interpreter who was kind of a little bit more like effeminate or something, and and again, playing with the American kind of stereotypes about Iraqis and like some of the Islamophobia. After we talked and we were walking away, he was like, "You see that effeminate guy there?" My NCO was like, "I think he was like gay or something," and I was like, "Oh, I don't know," But there's a common misconception, especially back then, that like Arabs are like have like high rates of homosexuality or something. And it actually ties in to something very old. It goes back several centuries, and I'll post an article in the video, description, inshallah, that you can click about Islam, the surprising link between Islamophobia and homophobia. Europe for a while would justify their like imperialism by claiming that Native Americans and Muslims were had rampant homosexuality. And they even, there were British authors writing, crazy, exaggerated, irrational stuff. They even claimed that they would, having these open, in the streets, full public view, open orgies with even young boys involved and stuff. And they wrote these crazy things which never happened. But part of the point of it was to sort of demonize the Muslim world and to make them look kind of uncivilized, and that it's the job of Europe. Same thing with the Native Americans and stuff. And that it was the job of Europe, to civilize these barbarians, and stuff like that. And what's interesting though is that, I don't actually think that the Muslim world has any higher rates of homosexuality than anywhere else, any other normal place. And one thing too, though, is that you'll see in some cultures, Muslim or otherwise, in parts like Africa, the Arab world, you'll see it among Christians, you'll see it among Muslims, you'll see it among different people, but you'll see men who are just friends holding hands. And perhaps some Europeans saw that, and even today, people go to Iraq and they see that and they say, "Oh, these people are gay," and it was and actually they're not. Sometimes they're both married to women, everything. It's just part of the culture. It's okay for good friends to hold hands. It's normal. It doesn't mean that they're homosexual. So that was one thing kind of peculiar that I've learned since. And actually even perhaps suspect that Europe may even have a slightly higher rate of homosexuality than the rest of the world. But anyways, that's a discussion for another time. If you're interested in this, you can read this article that my friend wrote. So as my time kind of dredged on in Iraq, I was only there for maybe less than half a year, less than 6 months probably. Maybe it's 4 months or something. Each day was very long though. Always endless stuff to do, and then at night you could spend your whole night just sitting on a radio all day, all night. And then I remember actually one of the NCOs brought in some videos for the night shift about movies, about no, sorry, it was a TV series, that's right, about Spartan, ancient, Spartan, slave gladiators and stuff like that, Spartacus. I think it was called Spartacus back then. It was some new TV series that was really violent and, entertaining, I guess. And I'd spend a good part of our night just watching that and trying not to fall asleep. I remember one night, I just felt like Iraq was just getting, it was just kind of there's something about Iraq, and I still feel there's something off about Iraq. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around that. It's in the, perhaps it's in the destabilization of the country, not even just from the war, but even just from the Saddam era, all those decades of the sweating bullets, that you might get arrested one night for no reason. And your friend might rat you out who got arrested last night, people being kind of on edge, people being two-faced, that's one thing about Iraq that I hear, as well as and especially in contrast to Afghanistan, is the feeling that people, as my friend put it, aren't dealing with you up front. People aren't that, people will lie to you. You don't know who who are your allies, who are your enemies. People will pretend to be your friend and then try to kill you type of feelings, or like they're, plotting against you behind the scene, there's a lot of like that type of stuff going on, between kind of everybody, I guess. It just has like that kind of feeling about it. Afghanistan, though, I've heard feels a little more upfront about things, and people tend to respect that a lot more than like the kind of backstabby, feeling of like Iraq. I remember one night I was standing out one night, just standing outside of my little housing unit, and I was like, man, I just feel like this, maybe there's some beauty to see, if I just look, and there's like this tree, and I was standing there like middle of the night or whatever. I was looking at this tree, and there's like a cat I saw climb out from under a housing unit, and I guess they're kind of like raised up like a foot or something. And this cat like crawls out, and I was like, and I was looking at this bird nest up in the tree that I've been looking at for like past couple of weeks, and I was like, there's some birds here at least, whatever. And then this other cat comes up behind that cat, and I was just watching these cats, like these like, stray, like wild, undomesticated cats, whatever, and like street cats. And then they both run up the tree and like attack this bird nest and like smack down. This bird falls down, and I was like, dang, whoa, what's going on? I was like, man, even like the animals are violent here. Like, dang, there's so much like what is up with this place? Like I can't find any peace here. This feels like, why there's so much just violence here? It's like, I don't know. Just a coincidence maybe, but it's just like, there's something off about Iraq, I don't know, just from my experience there. And then I'm sure, if I'd love to go back as a tourist one day, and I'm sure there's tons of beauty to see. There's so much history there. I would love to go back, and I'm sure I'll see tons of beauty, inshallah, if I go back as a tourist. But that was just kind of my experience. But even then, there is something kind of off about Iraq, I feel like, to this day, a little more subtle than can be described in this video, perhaps. Another time, I remember I was standing with like 3 or 4 people, kind of in that same area actually, and we were like talking about whatever, I don't remember, something like, business type of conversation, right? And then there's a medic in front of me and another soldier to my left, and the medic in front of me just puts his hand over his mouth, and he just goes like, oh, and he's like kind of he's looking down at the guy's feet to my left, and he was like, oh, and then the guy to my left is talking to the guy to my right, and then in front of me is that medic, like with his hand over his mouth, like kind of surprised and shocked. I look down to my left, and we all look down, and we look at that dude's feet, and he had like, there's a bird on the ground, and he had like stepped on this bird, and it was like holding his beak open at him. And we were like, oh man, you have your boot and you just like stepped on this bird that's like, I guess, dying already. But and we were like, oh man, it's just like, I just felt like every day, like my mind is just like slowly slipping away at this place. There's a whole bunch of other things that happen that I don't have time to describe. A lot of tension, a lot of just people being dumb, people being kind of selfish, people doing, stuff like that. Other times there are people who are chill and who are like, just chill out, man. There's nothing going on. But that place will kind of mess with your head in general. Without getting into too many details, that place will kind of mess with your head over time. And another day, I remember I heard this just gunshot. It sounded like a 50 cal from another unit, like on the other side of this wall. And I was like, I heard people like rushing and scurrying and stuff like that. And like some guy was with like the field artillery battalion. Well, it took his 50 cal off the gunner, and like as he was lowering it down through his turret, like he made some serious mistakes, like probably 2 or 3 serious mistakes. He didn't properly clear his weapon, he didn't even have the safety on, like a number of mistakes, probably made like 3 or 4 mistakes. And then he had the barrel pointed at him as he was lowering it down, and he assumed it was, he properly cleared it when he didn't. And then he accidentally shot himself and like right in the chest with a 50 cal, and he died. And for a moment I thought about running over there, but I could hear other people. I was like, okay, they already have the help they need. But I was like, okay. And then another time, one of our soldiers was walking outside of his housing unit, and there was a guy with like a slingshot who was messing around with it, like shooting people. And he fired his slingshot, and right then this other guy stepped out, and it hit him right in the eye and blinded him. And he never recovered his vision. And later on, he was discharged from the military. I remember I saw him later, and I was like, yeah, like, hey, what happened? Like, is your eye gonna recover or not? He's like, nah, like it frayed his nerve, and so it's like just his eye is done. But I remember one thing he said. He was like, when I was on the plane, when I got on this plane, because they had to rush me to Germany because I might lose my eye. It's like when I was on this plane, they flew me to like Kuwait or something like that, and like some intermediary flight, and then they put me on like a medical flight to Germany. He's like, and I was there with like all these other like casualties. He's like, I felt like the least injured guy there. He's like, I saw a lot of people who were IED casualties from like Afghanistan, and one guy had lost, I think, all 4 of his limbs. He's a quadruple amputee from like a horrible IED. And he said somehow this guy was like typing on a screen, and he was like sitting there wondering like, how is he typing a screen? And that's how he like called this nurse over, because he guessed he couldn't speak or anything. And then when he needed something, he like type on this screen, and then the nurse would come and get him like this or that or whatever. And he's like, the whole time I was just sitting there wondering like, how is he typing on this screen? And like, I think maybe they have like an eye scanner thing where you can like look at a screen and like type on a keyboard or something. But yeah. And another time I remember I was near like this medical tent, and this guy came up who was in like a ton of pain, and he had like his hand wrapped up, and he had apparently like something fell in his hand, and he just crushed his hand, and it was like, ooh. It looked very painful. And like, so like around me was just people getting hurt from like random things. There's another time too when like I was in like a Connex, which is like a freight container, and we were moving all this stuff around, like heavy box stuff, and my arm wound up getting like, I don't know how many pounds, a good amount of pounds of weight just kind of like crushed on my arm. And I pulled my arm out, but I was totally fine, and I was like, dang, okay. I just kept looking around, and I was like, man, people are getting like seriously injured from like seemingly small things, but then like other people don't get injured at all. Like some people die from like the simplest things, and then other people, nothing happens to them, and it was just like, it was very odd, just thinking about that. I just thought, especially when you think about the decree of God, it's like, what he wills to happen is going to happen, and you're not going to escape it. What he doesn't will, what he wills not to happen, is not going to happen. You're here and you're gonna live or you're gonna die. You're gonna get injured or you're not. And just do everything you can to avoid it. And then another time there was like a single lone rocket that hit the base in Kirkuk, and it killed a guy. Like a piece of metal went up his neck, and my NCO had seen it actually, because he was there, and he told me about it. He's like, we went over there and we saw this guy or whatever, and like a single piece of like metal or debris had gone into his neck, and one of the surgeons came running up, actually, and he was like, get out of the way, get out of the way. And he came up and he started stuffing the wound, and then with like this quick clot gauze, and then and the guy just like died in front of everybody. He just bled out, and it was like, wow, a single small piece of metal just killed that guy, And then other people would just like not be hurt at all by things, That was something that's kind of interesting to me, Another time I had like my mind just went like into oblivion at one point. It's a very long story, but I was just like, I started having like suicidal thoughts and stuff, and frustrations with people mainly was it. It's a very long story, so I won't even tell that. But at one point, I remember though, I was like, man, I have my M4, I was like, I got, all these rounds. Like, I can just load my weapon and just like kill myself right here if I wanted to. I was sitting in my housing unit once, and I was just having these suicidal thoughts. And I remember something that my cousin had told me. He was like, if you have like a big decision to make, he said, like, put it off as long as you can. He's like, never like rush a big decision, And in that context, he was talking about buying like a new car or a new truck. He was like, yeah, wait a couple of weeks before I even think about that. Maybe in 3 weeks I'll be like, what was I thinking? I don't need a new car, He's like, so just put everything. If there's any big decision, if you can put it off as long as you can, he's like, just put it off. Don't make a rush decision. I remembered that, and I was like, well, this is a pretty rush decision. I'm like, let me just think about this. And I was like, well, what does God have to say about this? What does the Bible have to say about suicide? So I just Googled it. I found this website. It was like, Christianity and suicide, or the Bible and suicide. And like, I read through it, and by the end of it, I was like, this is a really bad decision, let's go ahead and not do that. and really, I really attribute that, whoever wrote that website, and I've written them like emails before thanking them, I really appreciate that, this webpage you made however many years ago, it might have, saved my life, at the end of it. And then I got moved to headquarters, which basically means I'm going to be sitting on a radio for like 14 hours a day, or a night, really. And so I had this night shift. What happened was, like, there was a guy there, I think he was like Vietnamese or something, and his staff sergeant was like the biggest, the most unkind man you'd probably ever meet. And he spent so much time insulting this guy, and you're stuck with him for 14 hours a day, really, like 13 hours a day, 12 hours a day, probably like around 13, 14 hours a day, through these radio shifts. And like, eventually the guy just like snapped, 2 months straight of like, or like a month or two straight of just like getting insulted for like literally 12 hours straight, like all day, constantly, and this guy is just like such a, jerk. He finally like stood up and was like, I'm gonna kill everybody. He's so mad. And then after that, they were like, whoa, okay now. And they were like, let's shift some people around and, decompress a little bit. So they sent the guy out to the line, and they switched me with another guy, and they kind of just rotated a bunch of people out. Apparently I had like some high like general tech score on my that like military test or whatever, so they were like, oh yeah, Greg has a high score, you should send him up there, because the sergeant major was like, send someone with a high GT score. I was like, sweet, I'm the one, all right. But luckily for me, they also switched the day-night shift, so instead of going under that and that staff sergeant, I got sent under another guy who was actually really awesome. And so I spent all this time sitting on this radio. It was very tiring, but eventually you get used to it after a while. And then it came down to playing these like old video games on the computers for a long time. All of us were sitting there bored. We were playing like, like Candy Crush type of games, like these really simple computer games. Apparently, like the guys before us had put these games on the computers in there. And so we're sitting there like clicking away, you hear people clicking away playing these games. And when someone loses whatever, they go like, oh. You hear someone on the other side of the room. And then I remember it was really funny. I thought it was just us like lower level guys, because there's the head officer, you could say, running like kind of commanding everything. Then there's like 6 of us in this room, kind of controlling all the radios and whatever, monitoring all this stuff, waiting for something to happen, And then I thought it was just us, playing these games. And then one day I went up over to like the head officer's computer or whatever, and he also was playing the video games. I was like, oh, you playing it too? I didn't know that. That was kind of funny. That was like the biggest surprise of like the whole deployment right there. It's so funny. He's such a hardcore dude. He has like so much combat experience in his life, It was really funny just seeing him also sitting there playing his video games. It's like you're the last guy I'd expect to be playing video games through this whole shift. So then our time in Iraq came to a close. So we were told to prepare for like a year or whatever in Iraq, I guess just in case, the status of forces agreement was, agreed upon by the Obama administration. But the Obama administration could not come to an agreement with the Iraqi government. And so the result is that we withdrew from Iraq in 2011. And so like to try to keep it as secret as possible, they didn't want anybody knowing exactly when we'd leave. Secrecy, war is all about secrecy and all that, right? And so they told us like, hey, act as normal as possible. Pretend like no one's leaving. Act as normal as possible so that no one knows that we're leaving, and we can just disappear one night, like all of us. And there's like, I don't know, hundreds of people there or whatever. I don't know how many people are on that base. A lot. And it's quite, in some ways it was quite an impressive withdrawal. In other ways, there were some mistakes that could have been disastrous but resulted in nothing. So it was like, all right. And so I remember as we were approaching the day, like when all of us would leave pretty much, my NCO would occasionally just be like, hey, Car, go check on this or whatever. I'd be like, okay. And I'd be like, do you want me to take like a battle buddy with me? Or if he's like, nah, you'll be all right. Just go check on your own. I'd be like, okay. And you're always supposed to have someone like with you. You're never supposed to walk around alone like anywhere pretty much. But he was like, yeah, whatever. He's like, you just go. I'd be like, okay. Bend the rules a bit, And I remember one time I went over to check on like somebody's radio or whatever. I was walking around and I was like, hey, where is like such and such troops, talk or whatever. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, it's over there behind those buildings. I'd walk over and I just kind of went back and forth like, where is this place? I cannot find it. And finally I walked through like behind some stuff and like found this place, this troop I was looking for. And as soon as I walk in, one of the NCOs just like goes like, who are you? And he's like questioning me and stuff. I was like, oh, I'm so and so at headquarters. And he's like, hey, he goes to the radio. He's like, hey, call headquarters and see if they actually sent somebody or not. He was like, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? He's like, I was like, oh, I came to check it, like if your radio is working or whatever, blah blah. And then he just kept questioning me like really intensely, and I was like, I don't know what's going on here. Like I guess because I was walking alone, it was very suspicious looking. And then he was like, you know what's going on? And I was like, no, I don't know. And he was sitting there basically planning their route and stuff they'd take to get out. And then finally they confirmed it. And he was like, hey, he's like, I don't think you know what's going on here, man. He's like, take your weapon and because I had my weapon slung over my back. He's like, take your weapon and put it into your front. Okay, and then load your weapon. Okay, and he's like, you're gonna walk around alone. He's like, walk around with a loaded weapon from now on. I was like, oh dang, okay. And then I did my stuff, went back, and I was like, okay, I don't know what's going on here. And finally, like I was told like, hey, we're leaving like really soon. And I was like, dang, okay. It snuck up on me. I didn't even know exactly when we were leaving. And like the next day, I was basically told like, okay, we're gonna break all this stuff down. We're gonna load it up, and then tonight you're gonna get on a flight. And you're gonna fly to another city. And I was like, okay. And I remember I left like a note. And I put it under a table. And I was like, I can't remember what it said, but I was like, maybe one day an Iraqi will come and look at this, And it said something like, hey, like I'm so and so. I'm an American. I hope we can be friends one day and we can have peace or whatever. And I just like put it under like a table. And I was like, maybe one day they'll read this and maybe have like a positive feeling. And then interestingly enough, so I went down to the airfield and there's this fishbone like control center, which is shaped kind of like a fishbone. And interestingly enough, I remember, if I recall correctly, I remember seeing like kind of like Arab looking guy there once. And a couple of years ago, I made friends with a guy named Anwar Al-Ghazani. He was an attendee at my local mosque, and he's in the Army even today. He trains pilots, like foreign pilots and stuff, on like, you know, how to fly cargo jets and helicopters and all this stuff. And interestingly enough, we were talking about our time in the military, and he told me about his time in Iraq and so on. I was like, hang on. He's like, tell me again about that other deployment. You were in Mosul? He was like, yeah. I was like, what year? And he was like, 2010 to 11 or 11 to 12 or something. I was like, whoa. I was like, I was there in 2011. I was like, maybe I saw you there. He's like, oh yeah, like that Fishbone like control center in the airfield. I was like, yes. I was like, dude, I think I saw you there, like, you know, 9 years ago. However years. I was like, wow, man, small world. You know, it's crazy. Like, since, I mean, back then I wasn't even Muslim, and now it's like I'm in Fort Worth, you know, and I met this guy at a mosque. We became friends, and it turns out we both were in the same like place in Iraq, you know, years ago. I was like, dude, what are the chances, man? That is like crazy. You know, what are the chances? That was really interesting. So then I flew down to Kirkuk. It's called Khas Warrior there. And interestingly enough, things became very tense. Like some people just started feeling kind of frustrated. They were like kind of angry that they were going home, because they were told like, you'll be here 12 months, and then they were like, never mind, you're going home. And people were like, I sold my house or something like that, you know. People were like, why did the officer tell us this, you know. People were getting really angry and frustrated, and there's like, people were fighting for like no reason. A friend of mine and I started kind of just fighting for like just out of fun and frustration and like just testosterone everywhere. Yeah, it was just Kirkuk was just like, had an odd feeling about it, you know. What's interesting too about Iraq is like, during my time there, we didn't really get attacked much, but the Iraqis were still getting attacked very regularly. Like, there were a number of bombings against the Iraqis. Like, someone would just car bomb like a market, you know, and stuff like that. People would occasionally attack the Iraqi soldiers at their checkpoints, and you know, and sometimes you can hear this stuff going on. You know, it's close enough. You can hear people getting shot or blown up. You can hear IEDs, you know, car bombs going off in the city or this or that. I remember one time in Mosul, actually, there was a car bomb that went off like right outside our front gate. It didn't hurt anybody, like, except the guy, you know, killed himself. It was a suicide, like, you know, car bomb. And I remember, like, I was laying in my bed, and it was at night, and the explosion was like, even though it was like a kilometer away, the explosion was big enough that it almost broke my window, and like the walls and everything shook, like, and I was like, whoa. Like, the window was like vibrating so hard, I was like, man, it almost just broke our window everywhere. I was like, maybe we should tape our windows in case glass goes flying everywhere. And later on, I remember I was just laying in bed once after I got back from Iraq, and I was just thinking about that guy who had, you know, just drove a suicide bomb into a vehicle, and I was like thinking about like forgiveness and stuff like that, and people's circumstances that determine what they do, and I was like, you know, that guy, he lived a certain life. He grew up learning certain things. He was in a certain situation. I don't know his specifics, but you know, he died believing that he was perhaps doing the right thing, or maybe he was in a tight situation and it felt like it was his only way out. You know, and I was like, you know, maybe if I was in his life, maybe I would make the same decision. I don't know. You know, and I just thought of forgiveness and the importance of like understanding people in their contexts, and you know, not just hating everybody, and just kind of letting things go. Quite interesting. I wonder, you know, if he were to meet me today, you know, it's kind of interesting, you know, seeing somebody like I'd probably be the last person you would expect, to convert to Islam. That one of those soldiers on that base that you kind of attacked actually converted to Islam. I wonder what he would think about that. He'd probably be really surprised. But yeah, I mean, just goes to show, just because I'm an American doesn't mean that I'm like better than these Arab guys or anything. Yeah. So this is actually more recent, but I decided to put it here. So there's a guy who's a former ranger that I know, and I kind of became somewhat acquaintances with. And he told me some very interesting stories about his time in Iraq. He was in Iraq in 2003 during the invasion, for example, and then other deployments after that. One story he told me, which is quite interesting, is that he was in an operation to, kill or capture who they called Chemical Ali. And Chemical Ali was the guy who's basically responsible, I guess, for the WMD usage against the Kurds back during the Iran-Iraq War. And in this operation, it's kind of interesting. So there's him and his ranger teams were going in one way towards this like compound where this guy was supposed to be, and then there was some like another infantry battalion coming in another way who wanted to like get them put themselves on the record as participating in the mission. In Iraq in particular, there's a lot of like kind of politics involved. People who want the medal, people who want the recognition. I'm the one who did this. My unit did that. I want to go down in history as XYZ, right? And so there was like this line of like palm trees, and he went forward through these like line of palm trees, and he was like behind like a tree, and he had his back to this tree, and he got on his radio, and his other guys are maybe however many meters away from him, maybe 50 meters away from him or something like that, behind him, and he goes, "Hey, I think there's a guy right behind me," and then his rangers looked and they were like, "Yeah, we don't see anything. I don't think there's anyone behind this tree here." He's like, "No, I think there's a guy like right behind me," and they're like, "We don't see anybody." And then he turns around, and right then there's a Iraqi Republican Guard soldier who's right there, who was actually right behind that tree, and he had a knife. I'm not sure why he had no weapon, but all he had was a knife, and trying to be a last-ditch effort to defend Iraq. And this Republican Guard soldier grabs his I guess M4 or M16, whatever he had, and like basically kind of like yanked it and kind of disarmed him. And then said it clearly was going to turn into a knife fight, and that's probably what both of them wanted. Test your mettle. And his rangers behind him started like cheering him on. They were like, "Yeah, like get him!" And I mean, in movies, a knife fight is very exciting. In real life, it's apparently also very exciting for everybody involved. And so he goes for his knife. The other guy already has his knife, and so he's wearing body armor, and this Republican Guard soldier try to stab him in the torso, but he didn't realize like he's wearing body armor, maybe like a Kevlar vest or something under, I don't know. But he stabbed him, and the knife just didn't go through, right? And he stabbed him a second time, and then a third time, and he actually dropped his knife the third time. He pushed so hard, and he caught his knife in mid-air, and then he took a fourth stab attempt, and he got him in the shoulder, this ranger, and the knife just went clean through his shoulder and like stuck out the other side. And then he grabbed and held his Republican Guard soldier's arm, his knife hand, so he couldn't like move or anything. And right then he got his knife out, and he stabbed him in the bicep, or like the forearm or the bicep, and then he pulled it out and then stabbed his Republican Guard soldier like up under his chin, like between his chin and his neck, basically, and basically, I guess you could say won the fight at that point. And then another ranger came up behind him, and right then, and like right when he stabbed him, the ranger behind him came up and like took a shot at the guy's head, and that was it. So this is a guy, he has like all these stories, but that one was like very unique. I've heard a lot of stories, and I've never heard anything like that before. One thing I asked him though, and I tend to ask soldiers, especially who've been to Iraq, this question. I'm like, have you ever had any? And he's Latino, and Latinos typically are more likely to have stories and to believe in like the supernatural, you could say. Now in Islam we generally call it like the unseen, or like jinn, right? To them, they don't have that kind of like detailed science of like the unseen, so they just call it like the supernatural. So I asked him, like, have you ever had any supernatural experiences in Iraq? And I was expecting him to say no, but he was like, yeah. And I was like, oh really? Like, well, what do you have? He's like, well, I have 2 stories. And I was like, okay. And so back in after the invasion, I believe he had took Baghdad or something, or maybe it was after that, I don't remember. But he was at the airport in Baghdad, and he had some time there, like pulling guard, and like I guess, and like in the control tower at the airport, and he spent some time in there doing whatever. And I said sometimes in the control tower in that airport, so there's like this winding staircase that goes up to the top, and sometimes you'd be going up or down the staircase, you just hear like an invisible person just like running up and down the stairs, and it was like really fast, and he said it freaked people out. They're like, what is going on? And it's like one time he was walking down these stairs, and you could hear somebody like further down the stairs like running really really fast up these stairs, like, and then it ran right past him, and he like backed up against the wall, and it like just ran right past him, like some kind of just like invisible thing just like running past it. Now in Islam we know this is like a jinn, right, most likely. This thing was just like running up the stairs for whatever reason, I guess just trying to tweak people out. And his other story is that at that airport, I think it was around 2003, 2004, maybe 2005. I think it was around 03, 04. Sometimes they would just hear people out in the airport, like a bunch of people like screaming, just like screaming. And then they would get in there, quick reaction force vehicles and stuff. They get in and like drive out there, and they'd be looking around where they heard all this screaming, and there'd just never be anybody. There's just no one. And they'd be like, what's going on? Like, we just heard a bunch of people like very clearly like screaming for like, something going on, and it happened several times. Like it kept happening. They're like, the first time it happens, you're like, I don't know what that was, huh? The second, third, fourth time, this thing keeps happening where you hear people screaming, and then you drive out there and there's no one there. You're like, okay, like this is something supernatural going on here. There's a number of other stories that soldiers have had in Iraq, different types of supernatural stories and experiences. I've heard other stories of a guy who got like yanked out of his cot by like invisible, by nothing. Like he's sleeping in his cot, everyone else is asleep, and he just gets yanked out of bed very violently, or stuff like that going on. Notably, so if you go into like Google Maps, you go south, you can type in, or you can even just type in Babel, Iraq, and you'll find like an area south of Baghdad called Babel, right? So this is actually Babylon. Babel is how you say Babylon in Arabic. And this is where in the Quran it talks about Harut and Marut, the 2 angels that were sent down, and they brought magic to the world as a test. Right? And they tell you, this is only a test for you. They told mankind, like, this is only a test for you. We're teaching you magic only as a test. If you do it, well, they said that, so then don't disbelieve, right? For that textful. So then don't disbelieve. This is only a test for you, so then don't disbelieve, right? So to do magic is like essentially like an act of disbelief in God. And so when it comes to Iraq, magic and jinn and stuff like that are kind of a prominent theme that you'll notice, And so earlier, when I look back at my experience, even my thoughts of suicide earlier, in my time in Iraq, it's not as surprising anymore. The mental health issues that you see go on in Iraq. There's a lot of stuff going on in the unseen world there as well, it seems like, and no doubt there's, a certain enemy of ours who wants us to act as foolish as possible and to essentially, kind of destroy ourselves and destroy each other out there. So I'm not that surprised with the amount of stories I've heard there. I'll tell you another story. So there's an Iraqi guy I know here in Fort Worth, and I also asked him a similar question. Have you ever had any like jinn experiences, like in Iraq or anything? It's kind of interesting if you go around asking people just in general, have you ever had a supernatural experience? Go up to a Muslim and ask them, have you ever had a jinn experience? I mean, you'll hear a lot of stories. Surprisingly, you'd be surprised. Like people you'd be like, oh, you've had experience. Oh, wow. And so he's like, yeah, I have. And I was like, oh, really? What happened? And he told me that one day, so he lived in Baghdad before he moved here. And one day there was like a lady so outside of so he lives in like a house, by the way. So there's like this compound style household in like, in Iraq and Baghdad. There's like a wall around you and like maybe like a garden out front. And then there's like the house inside this like, kind of compound, like a yard or whatever. And so in front of his house in the street was like a market in the day. And so one day like a lady came walking by and she asked like, hey, can I get some water? And they were like, yeah, sure. So they have a seat. And so they gave her a chair and she sat down at his lawn. And then he came out and gave her some water. Because it can be hot or whatever, and people are in the market. It's not like that uncommon. And then she drank the water and left. And shortly after that, he started having weird things happen in his house. The first thing was like he was having dinner at one night, and then like these papers just appeared out of thin air and just fell all over the table. And he picked them up, and they said like these threats in Arabic. Like we're gonna scare you, we're gonna do this to you, we're gonna do that to you. And they were like, oh, okay, we got jinn in the house. And then after that, it was just like random annoying things happening in the house. They would like, one day, like he'd go to his fridge and his fridge is empty. And they'd take the jinn had taken all the fruits out of his fridge and just like put like a fruit on each step on his staircase, Another time, like his watch was missing. And then like he went and found it in like an AC unit, like just random things, annoying things really. He was like, these things are weak, man. Like they're so, and I agree. The thing about jinn is like they want to scare you, but they can't really actually do a whole lot typically. Usually they can only do things to people if magic is done directly on a person, or if that person commits like a serious sin, like they go and start messing around with magic and things that they really should not be doing, and they know they shouldn't be doing. That's the only time you really have like a possession occur or something like that. But this time, his house was like basically cursed, you could say, had magic done on it. And so then he went to a guy who kind of specializes in these things. You call it a raq in Arabic. And this guy gave him a bunch of like Quranic prayers to do. And he was like, take this and take a cup of water and recite all of these verses of the Quran into the water, like really close to your mouth, so that the water is like moving. Say these prayers into the water, and get some like a friend or two who will not be scared, because when you get very emotional, jinn will have a little bit more power over you. You don't want to be scared. You don't want to be super scared, super angry, super anything. You want to be very like moderate in your demeanor. In your emotions. He said, go get somebody who's not going to be scared and to help you, okay? And you're going to do this into the water, and then you're both going to take a cup of water and go into the home. Open the front door, and then you're going to take some of this water and flick it into every corner of every room, because the jinn tend to hang out in the corners of rooms. And so he did this. And he said when he would take the water and flick it into the corner of the room, you could hear like an invisible, a jinn running. Like it would just take off running, and you could hear its footsteps, like running across the, like running across the floor towards the front door. And then another thing the raq had told him to do was he took like this piece of like wood and he wrote these verses of the Quran on it. And then he took them and like they bolted them into his wall outside. And they said that the raq had told him, so what happens when you catch a thief in your house? And he said he's going to run away, right? He's like, yeah. And when he runs outside, what is he going to do? He's like, yes, you're going to jump the fence, right? He's like, yes. So you're going to take these signs, you're going to bolt them into the wall. These verses of the Quran, you're going to bolt them into the wall. So he's like, okay. And so this jinn he flicks the water in the corner of the wall. The jinn goes running outside. And then when it goes to jump the wall, he's like, the sign like slammed down. And then this jinn was just like burst in flames. And just, I guess it died. And he went out to his yard. And he said he saw it. And he went to his yard. And he was like, wow. And he said there's ashes, actually, from like the remainder of this like jinn, I guess. And you could pick it up and hold it in your hand. It was like these ashes. And I was like, wow. Yeah, there's something interesting about Iraq. So there's something going on there, in the unseen, like no wonder people have, all this kind of behavioral, like mental health stuff going on for like the soldiers who are there, I mean, there's other factors there. You don't want to be black and white about things, say it's, 100% this or it's 100% this, but it's one of the multifaceted factors involved in, human behavior. And I suspect. What's interesting, I was like, so I asked him, like, how do you find out this happened? He said, well, we realized, shortly after that lady had come into our yard for water, I went back to her and whatever and asked her, like, I was like, what'd she say? Like, did you ask her, like, why she did it? He's like, yeah, it's just some ignorant person, he's like, some people in the world are just really ignorant, it was just like some kind of jealousy, hatred for the family, whatever type of stuff going on. He didn't have like a clear explanation for it. I was like, okay, very, you don't really hear stories like this in America, right? But they do happen here as well. Perhaps not as much among like the, typical Caucasian population, but there's stories like that do happen here.